Alright everyone, we start off today talking about Rand Paul being literally the only member of the Senate with any economic sanity, and apparently the only one that's not planning to get a kickback through this $40 billion aid deal. Can I please ask what I think is a pertinent question? Right now a lot of people bitching about Rand Paul. Oh my god, he's holding up sending $40 billion to Ukraine temporarily because it's just a blockage of unanimous passage, forcing actual debate, forcing the senators to actually look into the details of the thing that they're about to pass, by the way. Again, Rand Paul, the sane man of the Senate. There's a reason why I like him for president eventually. I'd love to see him as VP under a Trump run in 24, and then I'd like to see him get a couple terms with DeSantis as his running mate, and then DeSantis probably getting a couple of terms with a TBA vice president. That's what I'd like to see. The future is going to be bright, and not so bright I have to wear shades. I think having Rand in an executive position at some point is probably a good idea. Just saying he seems to be sane. But can I ask a pertinent question? When you're on the edge of a recession, massively in debt, although much of it is domestic, people don't understand what debt is most of the time. You're arguably entering a stagflationary cycle. You've definitely got considerable inflation. It's at the second highest level it's been in 40 years. It'll probably tick up next month. I don't believe that the 0.2% reduction in inflation is anything other than it kind of sort of leveling it out temporarily. Did this before last April, if I remember correctly. Can I ask this? Is it wise at such a time, and plus shortages and all the other problems we have, to send $40 billion to a foreign state? You're going to have to make up for it in inflationary terms. You're going to have to borrow the money or print the money. Effectively, this is asking the lower and middle class Americans who already have a deep economic crisis on their hands to pony up $40 billion more big ones. Can I ask this? If you're going to print $40 billion new dollars of funny money, why not give it to the American people in the form of some sort of basic relief for the lower class, which right now is getting screwed, blued, and tattooed backwards by Bidenomics? That's number one. Number two, let me ask another question. When this sort of attempt of near unanimous consent especially is used, or any other methodology in the House or Senate used to try to push through a bill in the dead of night, effectively. It's hastily crafted. It's meant not to be debated on or to be as fast-tracked as possible. What almost inevitably happens afterwards? We find it was pig in a pokeism. It wasn't necessary, number one. It wasn't proper, number two. Typically riddled with a bunch of riders that have nothing to do with the bill, number three. And of course, there's stuff in here that doesn't directly involve Ukraine at all. And we find that a bunch of corruption and kickbacks were involved. If you're going to send $40 billion to a nation like Ukraine, which has systemic political corruption, you can think all the bad things in the world about Putin that you want, and of course I oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That does not make Zelensky a non-corrupt individual. It just makes him the executive that happens to be overseeing a largely partisan response with huge amounts of international support. That doesn't mean he and his generals and the other people in Ukraine aren't corrupt. They come from the same Soviet diaspora, albeit a separatist one, and it deeply influenced the political goings-ons in Ukraine. Zelensky and others in Ukraine were targeted for years by even the Western legacy media for corruption, especially money-related corruption. Attacks on the press, the same ones that happen in the West now as well. Ukraine marginally westernized, I suppose. And now all of a sudden everyone's arguing that Rand Paul is a Russian sympathizer for saying, hey, let's hold debate on this. I would ask a third question. Here's one that I don't see people mentioning. If Ukraine, according to all Western sources, is beating the shit out of the Russians and easily holding its own and making actually progress in certain parts of Ukraine, and if Putin is a failure and he's pooping his pants and Russia's having real big strategic problems and their generals don't often have, and this is true, actual battle experience, and so they keep getting knocked off or making mistakes. If Ukraine's doing so well, why do we need to fatten them up with $40 billion additional dollars? People talk about humanitarian aid. Okay, what are you going to do? You're going to go build tents in an active war zone that the Russians are going to burn down anyway? You're going to build a hospital that'll get bombed anyway? It's fruitless. It's bullshit. It doesn't need to be passed. I'm hazarding a guess that an increasing number of lower and middle class Americans agree with this basic premise. You can dislike Russia's invasion. You can think Putin's the Antichrist if you want to. It doesn't make Ukraine non-corrupt. It doesn't mean that the Senate's not supposed to debate on these things and actually, before the public, hold some sort of, even if it's a show hearing, to explain why we should be paying $40 billion. I congratulate Randpaul. This is another gold star moment for him. Again, everyone else in the Senate votes for this. All of the Democrats and all but one Republican. Randpaul is the only person in the room who slows it down marginally and says, hey, let's explain to the American people this spending, this gift to Ukraine. And that is what it is. Ukraine is right now at war with a nuclear power, and we keep upping the ante. You've also got Finland now fast-tracking a NATO application. That I have no problem with. The Finns can do with Finland what they fucking want. Anyway, I don't think the Russians are crazy enough to invade Finland again after the Winter War, but they want the additional protection, I suppose. I don't see Putin wanting to replicate the mistakes of Joseph Stalin. I don't think that it would go over very well, and I think the Finns would win, actually, especially since Russia's manpower is being depleted at the moment, along with their armor. Regardless of what you think about the actual casualty counts given by the Kremlin and by Kiev, there's some attrition there. I don't think that's really an arguable point at this point. If this were to pass, and it probably will, to be clear, Randpaul may vote against it in the final vote as well, but it'll be near unanimous to give this funny money printing package to Ukraine. A lot of it will be embezzled. That's just the long and short of it. Corrupt general says, well, I've gotten this $1 billion for this, military project. They're not going to miss $1 million. There's no point, no oversight. There's no strings attached. We're just getting effectively pallets of cash and other handouts. Why wouldn't you? Again, Ukraine is a subdeveloped country with a Soviet-influenced style of government that has been deeply criticized for years and years. The second Putin gets involved, because of the, everything is Russia line that the U.S. and other Western countries have used for the last half decade, all of a sudden we have to say, well, he may be a corrupt, cronyistic oligarch, but he's our corrupt, cronyistic oligarch. We've used this methodology before. We supported Hussein against the Iranians. The Pentagon gave him intel that allowed him to use chemical weapons against Iranian forces. We had backed the Iranians against the Iraqis. We've backed groups in Syria. Look at the FSA that we backed in Syria, a bunch of Islamofascists. It's what they were. They just happened to be nationalistic. They didn't want a caliph state under ISIS, and that's what they were fighting against, while also fighting the stabilizing force of the Syrian government that had brought about some degree of prosperity there. In Libya, we backed militia groups that now have completely destroyed the country. If anything, our further involvement to the tune of $40 billion is not going to help. It's not going to help logistically to any degree. What are you going to do, fire pallets of money at the Russian tanks? Go ahead, sell them weapons all you want. This is a handout. This isn't some Lend-Lease program where you're saying, okay, we're going to give you 40 billion, big ones. We'll prop up your economy and everything. We'll give you the food and all this aid. Once you defeat the Russians, you can pay it back. That's not what's happening here. There is a Lend-Lease style program for certain military goods, but a lot of it's just being given for free. This is a handout, and members of Congress are voting for it because a lot of them have ties to companies that operate in Ukraine and will benefit directly from the sale, or from, in this case, the gift. Some of these people, and this is why Congress shouldn't be allowed to hold stocks. All of them have stocks in weapons companies and pharmaceutical corporations and stuff, and these inevitably, it's a total coincidence, but inevitably policies are built around ideas that help these companies. And then all of a sudden the politician makes a huge amount of money. I liked watching the stock growth of some members of Congress, Pelosi, Schumer, McConnell as well. Crenshaw, big in there. I liked how we're talking about corporate profits and price gouging while these same members of Congress have huge amounts of investment into these same corporations. Rand appears to be largely beyond this. I liked when they were talking about, I think, wasn't it Rand's wife had some stock in some company that was tied to, COVID treatments other than like the vaccine, like Johnson & Johnson. And people bitched about it. Well, look at everyone else's conflicts of interest with regards to Ukraine. Hell, Biden was embezzling money through Ukrainian dealings through Hunter Biden. This story was actively suppressed, and all of a sudden, this is happening. How much is the big guy getting a cut of this? I mean, he wouldn't sign it if he wasn't, probably. That's the way that DC works. You don't have to say that Moscow, that the Kremlin is above board and that Putin's not nuts. Of course he is. He's embezzled billions from his own people. He lives a lavish lifestyle, and the oligarchs do too, and it's the same kind of cronyistic system in Moscow. That's the other point that I'd like to make. I love it when people look at this and they say Rand is a Russian agent. Well, no, that's clearly not the case, number one. And number two, why is it that so many people can't look at the situation with a more detached view and separate themselves from this weird dichotomous thinking where it's inevitably Moscow good, DC bad, or DC good, Moscow bad, and they're proxies by association lumped in with them usually, when really they're all corrupt. There aren't many nations in the world today other than deeply destabilized regions without a true state function in which the state function's not brutally corrupt. You see it all the time. This will be swindled via slush funds and kickbacks anyway, and it will pass in the end, but the American people deserve to at least have a little bit of a floor show in which some of the senators are forced to talk about the Ukrainian bill, put their thoughts out there on record, on paper, and not just simply want unanimous consent with the ayes have it. Well, all 100 senators voted in favor, so we're sending money to people, again, during a very grave economic period for the United States and indeed for the entire Western world. We're about to get slamma-jammed even harder come late summer because we're going to have more shortages due to what's happening right now in China. They're locking down even further, so more and more port closures. That's a huge shipping muscle that exports to many Western nations. That's going to hurt. Right while you also have soaring fertilizer prices. Everything, the price of everything is going to skyrocket come later this year. It'll start rearing its head before the midterms. Most of the damage won't be until after. Remember that when you punish these people, and look at all of the Republican senators that supposedly are so MAGA, so pro-liberty. Only Rand, he's the only one who blocked the passage. The only one with the balls to do that. That's about all. Peace out.